Hello and welcome. In this episode, I am going to share encounters with Dogman. These stories include a young man and his group of friends who saw a creature at an abandoned factory that wanted them out of its territory, and a man who tells the story about, quote, his werewolf when he was a child. But first, we start with a young man who saw something jump in front of his car while riding with his friends one day. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who tells about what happened to his friend when he was off-roading with some friends in New Jersey. Their story takes place near Manchester, New Jersey. Manchester is a township located in Ocean County in the eastern part of the state. It's notable due to it being the location of the Lakehurst Naval Air Station, which was the site of the Hindenburg disaster on May 6, 1937. As of the 2020 census, it has a population of 45,115. For the sake of the story, the original poster calls his friend Harold. The two friends Harold went off-roading with, he calls Chris and Alan. The names have been changed for privacy reasons. Harold starts off by saying that he spent most of his free time outdoors after getting his license at 17. He has hiked all over the East Coast, but mainly in New Jersey, being that's where he's from, near Pine Barrens. His encounter took place after he had graduated college with a degree in environmental science. This is important to the story, he says, because he has extensive knowledge of plants and animals, so when he sees an animal in the woods, whether it is day or night, he knows what he is seeing out there. He shared his story with his friend, who in turn shared it online because he still cannot wrap his mind around what he encountered that day. He believes certain types of cryptids can and do exist based on if the biology of said creature is possible, but what he did not think would be on that list was a bipedal canine. On the day of his encounter, he embarked on an off-roading adventure with his two buddies, Chris and Alan. They decided to explore the off-road trails in Manchester, New Jersey in Alan's truck. Their destination was a spot near an abandoned brick factory where Alan's off-roading friends often gathered. When they arrived, they joined the group and spent a few enjoyable hours driving around the dirt trails and hanging out with everyone. He points out here that he was sober that day, refraining from consuming any alcohol or pot because he had to drive back home later. Alan also remained sober, however Chris was a bit high. As they prepared to head back down the trails to the main road to leave, Alan reminded him to keep an eye out for deer. Driving at a moderate speed of about 35 miles an hour, they cautiously navigated the trails, remaining in the middle of the 30-foot wide path to allow for quick reactions in case a deer darted out in front of them. They drove on for a few more minutes before Harold caught sight of what he believed to be a deer running alongside the truck. It was concealed behind the tree line, and the glimpses he caught of it were nothing more than dark patches of brown fur. But just as he was about to tell Alan about it, anticipating that the deer might dash out in front of the vehicle, it suddenly accelerated, leaving them behind. It maintained its course within the tree line and got approximately 20 feet ahead of the truck before it leaped out onto the road. He says what he saw that day will forever be etched in his memory. The creature stood up on its hind legs and locked eyes with them before dashing across the 30-foot wide road in only a few strides and disappearing into the tree line. He has no doubt what he saw that day was a dogman. He describes it as standing approximately 7 feet tall, which is based on him comparing it to Alan's lifted truck. It had a coat of dark brown fur that covered its entire body except for its chest and stomach. These areas still had a bit of fur on them, but a lighter shade. Underneath the fur, he says he could make out incredible muscle definition reminiscent of an Olympic bodybuilder. This creature's head resembled that of a canine, featuring a long snout and two distinct wolf ears that were perked up when it was looking at them. It stood on large muscular legs and had very muscular arms and large hands that had visible claws sharp enough to do major damage. This thing's eyes, according to Harold, were an unnatural color that was unlike anything he had ever witnessed in the animal kingdom. As soon as it leaped into the foliage on the opposite side of the road from where it came, Alan hit the brakes hard, while Chris blurted out, "I know I'm high, but what the actual F was that?" Both of them turned to Harold, their faces filled with confusion, and asked for him to give any possible explanation as to what that thing just was, given his extensive knowledge on animals. Harold, however, sat there utterly speechless and unable to provide them with any rational or scientific explanation for what they had just seen. Alan stepped on it then, and they made their hasty retreat from the area. Chris still firmly believes that what he saw that day was just a hallucination due to him being high at the time. Alan, who is a skeptic when it comes to anything supernatural and absolutely refuses to even entertain the idea that beings like this could exist, still refuses to talk about the incident and acts as if it never happened. As for Harold, he still has no logical explanation for what they saw that day. He still doesn't believe that bipedal canine-like creatures could logically and/or biologically exist, but he says that's exactly what he saw and that it was very real. One thing that always stands out to me in cryptid stories is how fast these creatures are said to be. But I guess if dogmen are as muscular as people describe, then there would have to be some power behind those legs. However, even in stories where cryptids are said to not be as muscular, they still move just as fast. This, at least to me, points to them being at least somewhat supernatural. Going back to how muscular Harold said this thing was, that's the case in just about every dogman story. They are said to be extremely built and very well defined. Even the females are said to be very muscular. Another thing about this story is how he said his friend Alan refuses to talk about their encounter. This happens a lot too, and is usually associated with the trauma or sheer shock of seeing something that isn't supposed to exist. People absolutely refuse to talk about seeing a creature like this and act as if the encounter never happened. I guess this could also be associated with PTSD. The fact that someone so well versed in biology with an extensive knowledge of animals has no idea or explanation for what he is looking at is something that definitely caught my attention about this story. The fact that he saw a dogman, has no explanation for it, and still insists that's what he saw instead of just dismissing it really says something, at least to me. What do you think about this one? And what would you do if something like that jumped out in front of your car? The next story comes from the same poster, who shared another friend's encounter near the same location where Harold had his in the first story. This one takes place in Manchester, New Jersey, near the abandoned brick factory mentioned during Harold's encounter. This friend's name is Jorge, and he had actually been to the abandoned factory before, taken there by his brother and Harold. He thought it was cool, so he decided to return one night with his own group of friends to explore. But what waited for them out there was an encounter with something he says he never thought was real. Harold had warned Jorge and his brother to never venture to the factory after dark, but they ignored his warning and went anyway. Harold had previously shared some encounters with Jorge that he had there, things that still haunted him, but Jorge brushed it off as just a joke. When they arrived, they began up the path leading to the factory. But as soon as they set foot out there, an unsettling sensation washed over the group. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Naturally, Jorge and his friends were spooked by this and nervously scanned the trees as they walked. Then, that's when they saw something peculiar. There, amidst the trees, he caught sight of something he says should not exist. Terror washed over him as he realized what he was looking at resembled a werewolf. The creature had piercing yellow eyes, according to Jorge, that seemed to peer straight into his soul. He describes it as being unusually tall, standing at an estimated 9 to 10 feet. It had wolf-like ears that were perked up and a lengthy snout. He says the head looked like that of a German shepherd or a wolf. Just like Harold, he describes this thing's physique as looking like that of a bodybuilder with bulging muscles underneath its fur. It also had hands that ended in claws. He blinked to make sure this thing wasn't just a figment of his imagination, but to his horror, his friends also reacted to it. This creature, which gave off an eerie presence according to him, seemed like it was urging him to come closer. The whole experience was unnerving and left him feeling like a deer in the headlights. He couldn't shake off the feeling that whatever this thing was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A primal sense of fear gripped Jorge then as he continued to look at this creature. According to him, it resembled an Egyptian jackal. The mysterious being simply stared at the group, intimidating them, and as soon as they thought it was gone, they got out of the area as quickly as possible. He says that to this day he is still unsure what they saw that night, but when his brother showed him a picture of a dogman, it sent a chill up his spine. The picture he was shown looked exactly like what he and his friends saw at the old factory. Jorge ends his story by saying he will never go back to that old abandoned brick factory. He feels like they encroached upon the dogman's territory and it was trying to intimidate them into leaving and never coming back. Well, it definitely had its intended effect, as Harold closes by warning anyone who reads his story to be careful when exploring Pine Barrens in New Jersey and to never go to that factory at night. I've always said it's a bad idea to go out looking for cryptids, and this story is a good example of that. We know very little about these creatures except what we hear in these stories, and we don't know exactly what they are capable of. This is especially true with dogmen, given how vicious they are usually described in these stories. This seems to be the case with this dogman as well. It's also worth mentioning that Jorge says the head looked like that of a German shepherd. This is very common when people describe dogmen. What's also common is a primal fear he describes coming over him in the presence of this thing, as well as him saying it's like they were in the dogman's territory and it wanted them gone. This happens a lot in dogman stories as well as with other cryptids, and people are even chased, but as soon as they leave the forest or area where the encounter took place, the cryptid just stops chasing seemingly for no reason. Everything points to this being them chasing someone out of their territory. Again, we have someone describing how muscular a dogman is, but this is also the same area where Harold saw the one in the first story, and I'm guessing that this could have been the same dogman. Chances are this is the case, but I will say that Jorge describes the dogman he saw as being noticeably taller than what Harold described in his story. Now I know the heights that they say these things are is just an estimate, so it's possible that they could have both been off a little bit. Perhaps it was the same dogman, or perhaps there is more than one in the area. I can't say I blame Jorge for not going back to that old abandoned factory. I don't think I would either. He went out there looking for something and found something he wasn't prepared for. It's a good thing the group was able to get out of there without further incident. Just goes back to my point about not seeking these things out. What do you think about this story? Do you think the dogman was just protecting its territory? And do you think it was the same one from the first story that Harold saw, or there's more than one dogman in this area? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had a dogman encounter way back in the mid-1990s. I like finding stories like these because it shows that dogman sightings aren't a recent phenomenon. Actually, I've heard of stories from the 80s and even farther back than that. This one takes place in northeastern Pennsylvania when the original poster was in the range of 6 to 8 years old. When he was younger, the OP would sneak out of his room on summer nights when he couldn't sleep, heading out to sit in his backyard. There was a hill there where he would sit on the other side of it, just far enough down that he was out of view of the kitchen window. To his left there were trees, and beyond that a vast open field stretching across to a valley that was about a mile wide. Below the hill where he was sitting there was a field with a deer trail that cut across the bottom of the hill. When there was a bright moon, he would be able to see all the way across the mile-wide valley to where his best friend's house sat. His home was equipped with floodlights that remained on throughout the night. He mentions here that he grew up in a very rural area, where the children there would often skip a few days of school when hunting season began. There were only 2 houses in sight of his from his backyard, and the closest Walmart was 30 miles away. Growing up in such a remote area, he became well acquainted with the local wildlife. Deer, bear, rabbits, and he even saw a mountain lion while hiking with his family on one occasion. The night when he first encountered the Dogman was just like any other evening. He was sitting there lounging in the grass, thrilled, he says, to be doing something that his parents had no clue about. He then caught sight of something moving swiftly along the deer trail. What he saw was so black that it stood out even from the night. As it made its way out of the woods near his house, it caught sight of him and came to a stop. The creature locked eyes with him for what felt like, to him, a very long time. This thing stood up on its hind legs with its long ears, which were visible from about 100 yards away, perking up. He says it was too slender to be a black bear, which he had seen a few times by that point in his young life. The staring lingered for a while before this thing finally lowered its ears, placed its front paws back onto the ground, and dashed across the valley. The OP nicknamed the creature his werewolf mainly because of how it stood up and the shape of it when it did. He never shared the encounter with anyone and says he enjoyed having his own little secret. Following that initial sighting, he found himself spending a lot more time outside. He distinctly recalls one night during a new moon when he remained on the porch, too afraid to venture further into the darkness due to the lack of the moon's light. He saw the Dogman 3 or 4 times after his initial encounter, with the creature usually running into the woods beside his home. The area where he saw it was part of 10 acres owned and designated just for hunting season. He didn't see his quote werewolf after that and remembers feeling disappointed as the weather turned colder, forcing him to cease his nighttime outings and consequently missing seeing the Dogman. This is far from the first Dogman story where I've heard that their coat is so dark that it stands out even at night or even when it's in the shadows. It's a fascinating trend that really sticks out to me when I hear or read a Dogman encounter. My guess is the Dogman was in the area hunting for food, especially being that the OP said the land close to his home was owned and used specifically for that purpose. However, it was meant for just the humans, but I guess the Dogman decided to use it for his hunting as well. Plus, when he saw the Dogman after the first encounter, it was going into the area used for hunting. I found this story interesting because the OP didn't get scared when he saw the Dogman and it didn't act aggressively toward him. Usually, people feel the evil emanating off of these creatures, and the Dogman seemed to enjoy instilling such fear in people. I'm wondering if it didn't see the boy as a threat, being that he was so young. I guess who they are aggressive toward and like to instill fear in, and who they don't, is just one of the mysteries we will never know the answer to. What do you think about this one? And what would you do if you saw a Dogman near your home? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.